Somewhere in the highlands of Bolivia, carved into a cliff face above a valley that most people will never visit, there are doorways cut from solid rock that lead nowhere. No rooms behind them, no chambers, no functional purpose that anyone has been able to establish. They have been there for thousands of years, and the people who cut them left no record of why. On the northern coast of Peru, in one of the driest places on Earth, an ancient city covers 20 square kilometers of desert. Enormous mud brick walls rise from the sand, their surfaces decorated with friezes of figures and animals that nobody has fully decoded. Stone statues stand at empty gates, staring out across courtyards that have not held a living person for centuries. Whatever civilization built this place is gone, its language unwritten, its rituals unrecorded, and the logic behind its extraordinary design still debated by every archaeologist who has walked its streets. Tonight, we are traveling across continents and through centuries to find 10 more of them. And trust us, there are entries on this list that you will not want to miss. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the outside world fade for a while. About 150 kilometers west of Cusco, in the Apurimac region of the Peruvian Andes, there is a granite boulder sitting on a hilltop that has been puzzling researchers for the better part of a century. It is not particularly large by the standards of Andean stonework, roughly 4 meters long, 2.5 meters wide, and 1.5 meters high. What makes it extraordinary is what is carved across its entire upper surface. The Sayhuite Stone is covered in a detailed three-dimensional relief of over 200 individual carved elements. Rivers, canals, terraces, stairways, pools, and platforms are all cut into the surface in a composition that clearly represents something specific. Feline figures, serpents, lizards, and toads are worked into the design alongside what appear to be human figures and architectural structures. The whole thing reads as a single unified scene rather than a collection of separate images added at different times. Someone planned this out and executed it with considerable skill across every inch of the stone's surface. The quality of the carving is worth dwelling on. The relief is not shallow. The channels representing rivers and canals are cut deeply into the granite, some running several centimeters below the surrounding surface. The terraces step down in miniature, in a way that mirrors the actual agricultural terracing found across the Andean landscape. The animal figures are rendered with enough detail to be clearly identifiable, the feline shapes distinct from the serpents, the lizards distinct from the toads. This is not rough or approximate work. It required skilled hands, appropriate tools, and a significant amount of time. Producing something of this complexity in granite, one of the harder stones to work, would have been a major undertaking regardless of what era it was done in. The stone sits within a broader ceremonial complex. Around the Sayhuite Stone, there are other carved features in the surrounding rock, channels, seats, and platforms cut into the hillside that suggest the area was used for ceremony and ritual over an extended period. Water appears to have played a role in how the site was used. The carved channels on the stone itself may have functioned as conduits for liquid offerings, with water or chicha, the fermented maize drink used in Andean ritual, being poured across the surface and flowing through the carved rivers and canals as part of a ceremony. Evidence of this kind of liquid offering practice has been found at other Inca sacred sites, and the design of the Sayhuite Stone's surface is physically consistent with it having been used that way. The Spanish colonial authorities knew about the stone. It appears in early colonial records, which means it was already considered significant at the time of the conquest in the 16th century. Serious archaeological study only began in the 20th century, and the question those researchers set out to answer, what does this stone actually show, has not been resolved. To understand why the stone exists at all, it helps to know something about how the Inca thought about the landscape. The Inca had a tradition of sacred stones, called huacas, natural or modified rocks, treated as spiritually significant and used as focal points for ceremony, prayer, and offering. These were not decorative objects. They were treated as living presences within the landscape, connected to the ancestors, the gods, and the forces governing the natural world. Carving a stone on this scale would have been an act of considerable religious and political significance, not something undertaken casually or without authorization from the highest levels of Inca society. Water was also central to everything the Inca built and believed. Their agricultural system depended on an enormous network of canals and terraces that moved water from high-altitude sources down to cultivated fields across the Andean landscape. Water management was not just practical, it was woven into religious practice, with rivers, water sources, and rainfall all tied to specific deities and rituals. The Apurimac River, which runs through this region and is one of the main tributaries of the Amazon, was considered one of the most sacred rivers in the Inca world. Its name in Quechua means speaking Lord, reflecting the reverence with which it was regarded. The carved rivers and canals on the Sayhuite Stone sit within that context, though exactly how is the part nobody has agreed on. The symbolic animal figures add another layer. In Andean religious tradition, the feline, the serpent, and the toad each represented a different realm. The feline was associated with the upper world and the sky, the serpent with the inner world beneath the earth, the toad with water and transitions between realms. All three appear on the Sayhuite Stone, worked into the landscape of carved rivers and terraces in a way that suggests the composition carries cosmological meaning alongside whatever physical landscape it might represent. But what specific place, system, or idea the stone is showing has never been established. It does not match any real landscape in the surrounding region closely enough to confirm it is a straightforward map. Whether it is a hydraulic model showing an ideal water management system, a cosmological diagram of the Andean universe arranged across a stone surface, a ritual landscape representing a sacred geography known only to Inca priests, or a political map showing territorial boundaries, no interpretation has gathered enough support to settle the question. Who made it adds further uncertainty. Some of the carving is consistent with Inca technique and style. Other elements appear different enough from known Inca work that researchers have raised the possibility the stone predates the Inca and was incorporated into their ceremonial landscape rather than created by them. The Inca were known to absorb and repurpose sacred sites and objects from the cultures they conquered across the Andes, so a stone of pre-Inca origin within an Inca complex would not be unusual. The evidence to confirm or rule out a pre-Inca origin has simply not been found. What is known is that the stone was deliberately damaged after the Spanish conquest. Sections of the carving have been destroyed in a way that looks intentional rather than accidental, with specific figures and features removed rather than randomly broken. The most likely explanation is that this happened during the colonial campaign to suppress indigenous religious practice, when sacred sites and objects across the Andes were systematically targeted. If that is correct, the damaged sections may have been the ones that carried the clearest visual information about what the stone represented and how it was used. Whatever was there cannot be recovered. Recent photogrammetric survey work has produced detailed three-dimensional digital models of the carved surface, making it possible to study features that are difficult to see in photographs or during a physical visit to the site. The models confirmed the full complexity and density of the composition across the stone's surface and revealed details in damaged sections that were not clearly visible before. They did not resolve the central question of what the stone represents. What they did show is that the carving extends further across the surface than earlier studies had mapped, and that the composition is even more elaborate than it appears at first glance. For most of history, the world known to Mediterranean civilizations ended somewhere around the Strait of Gibraltar. Beyond that narrow passage lay the open Atlantic, largely unexplored and largely unknown. But the cultures that did venture out there, the Phoenician traders who sailed the western Mediterranean routes, brought back accounts of a kingdom on the far side of the strait that was unlike anything closer to home. They called it Tartessos, and by every description they gave of it, it was extraordinary, Greek writers, including Herodotus, describe Tartessos as one of the wealthiest trading partners in the known world. Silver, gold, and tin came out of the region in quantities that made it commercially significant across the entire Mediterranean. The Phoenicians, who had established a trading settlement at what is now Cadiz on the southwestern coast of Spain around 800 BC, maintained close commercial ties with the Tartessians for centuries. The relationship was mutually beneficial and well documented in the historical record. What is not documented is where the Tartessian capital actually was, or what happened to the culture when it disappeared. Tartessos is believed to have flourished from roughly 900 to 500 BC, centered on the lower Guadalquivir River Valley in the region now called Andalusia in southwestern Spain. The culture produced distinctive and high-quality objects, elaborate gold and silver work, bronze figurines, and ceremonial objects that have been found at sites across the region. They also developed a writing system, which survives in around 50 known inscriptions carved mostly onto funerary stelae, the flat stone markers used to commemorate the dead. That writing system has only been partially decoded, and what it says in full remains unclear. The mineral wealth that made Tartessos famous in the ancient world came largely from the Rio Tinto mines in the hills north of Huelva, one of the richest silver and copper deposits in the ancient Mediterranean. These mines have been worked across different periods of history and are still active today. In the Tartessian period, they would have produced silver on a scale large enough to fund significant trade networks and attract the attention of every major maritime culture in the region. The Phoenicians were not sailing to southwestern Iberia out of curiosity. They were there for the metal. The Tartessians also appear in the Hebrew Bible, referred to as Tarshish, a distant and wealthy land associated with ships, silver, and long-distance maritime trade. Whether Tarshish and Tartessos are the same place has been debated by scholars for a long time and has not been settled. The identification is plausible and has supporters in the academic literature, but the biblical references are not specific enough to confirm it. Then there is the Atlantis connection, which is worth mentioning because it keeps coming up in serious academic discussion rather than just popular writing. Plato described Atlantis in two of his dialogues, written around 360 BC, as a powerful and wealthy island civilization in the far west that disappeared beneath the ocean. Several researchers over the years have pointed to the similarities between Plato's description and what is known about Tartessos: the location, the wealth, the sophisticated culture, and the disappearance from history around the time Plato was writing. The mainstream academic position is that Atlantis was a philosophical invention, a narrative device Plato used to make a point about hubris and decline. But the Tartessian connection has attracted recurring attention from serious researchers, not just from enthusiasts, and the debate has not entirely closed. The most significant mystery surrounding Tartessos is the simplest one. The city itself has never been found. Ancient sources strongly suggest a major urban center somewhere in the lower Guadalquivir region, possibly near the modern city of Huelva, or further south toward the coast. Decades of archaeological work across the region have not produced remains that can be confidently identified as the Tartessian capital. The Guadalquivir Delta is a difficult landscape for archaeology, with shifting river channels, marshland, and significant sediment accumulation that could have buried major remains under several meters of material. It is entirely possible the city is there and simply has not been reached yet. It is also possible the site has been destroyed or is now underwater. The best documented Tartessian site known to archaeology is not a city at all. Cancho Roano, in the Extremadura region of Spain, is a sanctuary complex excavated from the 1970s onward that has produced significant quantities of Tartessian material, including ceramics, metalwork, and evidence of ritual activity. It confirmed the existence of a sophisticated material culture and gave researchers their most detailed look yet at how Tartessian sacred spaces were organized. But it is a sanctuary, not a capital, and it does not answer the question of where the people who built it actually lived. In 2023, archaeologists announced findings from a site called Casas del Turunuelo, also in Extremadura, that drew significant international attention. Excavations there uncovered a remarkably well-preserved Tartessian building, intact to a degree rarely seen in Bronze and Iron Age Iberia, with an upper floor still in place. Inside the building, researchers found the largest known animal sacrifice deposit from this culture, involving horses and other animals in large numbers. The scale of what was found pointed to a major ritual event, and the physical evidence suggested the building was deliberately sealed and closed as part of that event, with the sacrifice connected to the act of closure itself. Why a building of this quality was ritually closed and abandoned in this way has not been explained. The Tartessian writing system adds its own layer of uncertainty. Around 50 inscriptions survive, most of them on stone funerary markers found at sites across southwestern Iberia. The script was used across a considerable geographic area and a significant span of time, suggesting it was a functioning writing system rather than a limited or experimental one. In studies published from 2009 onward, John Koch of Cardiff University argued that the language of the inscriptions was Celtic, which would make Tartessian the oldest known written Celtic language by a considerable margin and would require a significant rethinking of how and when languages spread across Europe. This interpretation has attracted serious engagement from other researchers, but remains contested, and the decipherment of the Tartessian script as a whole is not complete. Around 500 BC, Tartessos disappears from both the written record and the archaeological sequence. The distinctive material culture stops showing up at sites, the trading relationships with the Phoenicians appear to end, and the culture simply ceases to be visible. The most commonly proposed explanation is that the expansion of Carthage, the powerful Phoenician-descended city-state in North Africa, disrupted the Western Mediterranean trading networks that had sustained Tartessian wealth. Without the silver trade, the economic foundation of the culture may have collapsed. But there is no direct evidence of what actually happened. No destruction layer, no recorded conflict, no clear point at which things ended. The culture just stops appearing. A civilization wealthy enough to be described in Greek histories, Phoenician trade records, and possibly the Hebrew Bible, with a writing system that reshapes the history of Celtic languages, if the current interpretation holds, and a capital city that has never been found. That is where Tartessos sits in the archaeological record today. On the northern coast of Peru, where the Andes drop toward the Pacific and the landscape turns to desert, there is an ancient city that covers 20 square kilometers of coastal plain. Its walls rise several meters from the sand, its streets stretch for miles, and enormous ceremonial courts sit open to the sky. Chanchan was the capital of the Chimu Empire, the largest pre-Columbian city in South America, and it has been standing in various states of ruin for over 500 years. The more carefully archaeologists have studied it, the stranger certain aspects of how it was built and governed have turned out to be. The Chimu Empire controlled a long stretch of the Peruvian coast from roughly 900 to 1475 AD, when the expanding Inca Empire brought it under their control. At its height, Chanchan housed somewhere between 30,000 and 60,000 people, a substantial urban population for anywhere in the pre-Columbian Americas. The city was built almost entirely from adobe mud brick, a practical choice given the extreme dryness of the coastal desert, which has helped preserve the structures far better than they would have survived in a wetter climate. The detail visible in the surviving walls, geometric friezes of fish, birds, and wave patterns repeating across large sections of decorated surface, gives some sense of how elaborate the city must have looked when it was fully occupied and maintained. The economy that sustained Chanchan was based on irrigated farming in the river valleys, cutting through the desert, fishing along the coast, and trade networks that reached as far as Ecuador and Colombia to the north. The Chimu were skilled craft workers, particularly in metalwork, and their goldsmiths and silversmiths were considered so accomplished that when the Inca conquered Chanchan in 1475, they relocated Chimu artisans to Cusco to work for the Inca court. That the Inca, who had their own sophisticated craft traditions, chose to import Chimu specialists, rather than simply train their own people, says something about the level of skill that had developed in Chanchan over centuries. The Chimu left no writing system and no deciphered texts. Everything known about their history and beliefs comes from archaeology and from accounts written down by Spanish chroniclers after the conquest, which in turn drew on Inca oral traditions about the Chimu, a further step removed from the source. This means that a great deal of what happened inside Chanchan, the political decisions, the religious practices, the internal social organization, is either inferred from the physical evidence or simply not known. The physical evidence is extraordinary enough on its own. The most distinctive feature of Chanchan is its 9 royal compounds, known as ciudadelas. Each one is a massive walled enclosure, the largest measuring around 600 meters long and 400 meters wide, containing an elaborate arrangement of rooms, corridors, open courts, storage facilities, a well, and a burial platform. The walls of the ciudadelas reach up to 9 meters in height in places, making them genuinely imposing structures that dominate the surrounding city. The interior walls are decorated with the same geometric friezes found elsewhere in Chanchan, covering large surfaces with repeating patterns of marine life and geometric forms. Each ciudadela was built by a different Chimu king and served as his royal palace during his lifetime. When the king died, the ciudadela was sealed. His body was placed in the burial platform along with significant offerings and, based on the skeletal evidence recovered by archaeologists, human sacrificial victims. The compound then became a mausoleum, no longer a working palace, but a maintained and venerated space tended by the dead king's descendants, who used it for ongoing ancestor rituals and who continued to hold authority over the wealth stored within it. The new king built a new ciudadela from scratch. This system is called split inheritance, and it is documented nowhere else in the ancient world, at this scale and with this particular architectural expression. The way it worked was that political power passed to the new king, but the accumulated wealth of the previous king, everything stored inside his ciudadela, remained attached to his compound and to his descendants rather than transferring to the new ruler. Each new king therefore inherited the title, but not the resources, and had to build his own economic base from the beginning of his reign. The ciudadelas sitting across Chanchan are the physical result of this system playing out across what appears to have been 9 successive reigns. Why the Chimu developed this arrangement and maintained it over several centuries is not understood. It created a situation where the ruling city contained multiple independent nodes of wealth and power, each attached to a dead king's compound, and managed by a different set of descendants alongside the new king building his own. How this was politically stable, how disputes between the different compound lineages were managed, and what happened to the system as the number of active ciudadelas grew over time are questions the archaeology has not answered. The burial platforms within the ciudadelas are where the most significant evidence of Chimu royal practice would have been concentrated, but they have been heavily looted. Spanish colonial-era looting of pre-Columbian burial sites across Peru was systematic and thorough, driven by the gold and silver objects typically buried with elite individuals. What was originally deposited in the Chanchan burial platforms, beyond the human remains and ceramic objects that could not easily be melted down, is largely unknown. The looting has made it extremely difficult to reconstruct the full picture of Chimu royal burial practice or to assess the scale of wealth that the ciudadelas once held. Even the basic question of how many ciudadelas exist and which king built which one has not been definitively established. The Spanish accounts recorded names of Chimu rulers, and researchers have worked to match specific compounds to specific rulers based on size, construction sequence, and location within the city. That process is still ongoing, and the matching of names to structures has not been confirmed with enough certainty to be considered settled. Recent archaeological work at Chanchan has shifted focus away from the ciudadelas and toward the areas between them, where the majority of the city's population lived. Different residential zones have been identified, ranging from relatively well-constructed intermediate compounds that appear to have housed middle-ranking specialists and administrators, to simpler, irregular structures that house the general population. This work has started to build a more complete picture of how Chanchan functioned as a city rather than just how its elite compounds were organized. The water management system at Chanchan is another area that has attracted serious study. Supporting a population of tens of thousands in a coastal desert required a reliable supply of fresh water, and the Chimu engineered large sunken reservoirs within the city to collect and store water drawn from the water table. These reservoirs, known as huachaques, were substantial structures, some covering hundreds of square meters, and they required ongoing maintenance and management to remain functional. How this water supply system was organized across the city and how it was sustained through the centuries of Chanchan's occupation is still being studied. When the Inca conquered Chanchan in 1475, they did not destroy the city. They absorbed it, relocating the skilled craft workers, as already noted, and incorporating certain Chimu administrative practices into their own imperial system. The degree to which the Inca imperial model was influenced by what they found at Chanchan, particularly the highly organized storage and distribution systems the Chimu had developed, is an ongoing area of research. Most of the mysteries on this list involve things that have disappeared: lost cities, vanished cultures, structures with no surviving builders. This next one is different. It involves a population that is still here, still speaking their ancient language, still living in roughly the same region they have occupied for thousands of years. And the more closely geneticists have studied them, the more unusual their story has turned out to be. The Basques live in a region straddling the western end of the Pyrenees Mountains, on the border between what is now northern Spain and southwestern France. They call their homeland Euskal Herria. There are currently around 3 million Basque people, with the majority living on the Spanish side of the border. They have their own distinct cultural traditions, their own cuisine, their own sports, and most significantly for our purposes, their own language. Basque, known as Euskara, is a language isolate. That means it has no known relationship to any other language in the world, living or dead. It is not related to Spanish, French, or any other Romance language. It is not related to any Germanic or Slavic language. It is not Indo-European at all. It has no connection to any Semitic language family. Linguists have compared it to virtually every known language group and found nothing that constitutes a genuine family relationship. Euskara stands completely alone in the linguistic record and has done so for as long as it has been studied. For a long time, the language isolate status of Basque was treated as an interesting curiosity, something to be noted and then set aside. The genetic research of the past decade has made it considerably more interesting than that. To understand what the genetics revealed, it helps to know something about what happened to the population of Europe over the past 10,000 years. After the last ice age ended, Europe was inhabited by hunter-gatherer populations, descended from people who had survived the glacial maximum in southern Refugia. Starting around 9,000 years ago, farmers from Anatolia, in what is now Turkey, began moving into Europe, bringing with them agriculture, domestic animals, and a different genetic profile from the existing inhabitants. These incoming farmers largely replaced or mixed with the hunter-gatherers across much of the continent over several thousand years. Then, around 5,000 to 4,000 years ago, another major shift happened. Groups associated with the Yamnaya culture of the Pontic steppe, the grasslands north of the Black Sea, in what is now Ukraine and Russia, expanded rapidly across Europe. They brought horses, wheeled vehicles, a pastoral economy, and, crucially, the ancestor languages of the Indo-European family, that today includes most of the languages spoken across Europe, from English and German to Greek and Russian. The genetic impact of this expansion was dramatic. Modern European populations carry DNA from all three of these groups: the original hunter-gatherers, the Neolithic farmers from Anatolia, and the Bronze Age steppe migrants, in varying proportions depending on where in Europe you look. The Basques carry substantially less steppe-related ancestry than almost any other European population. A landmark study published in Science in 2015 by Wolfgang Hack and colleagues which analyzed ancient DNA from prehistoric Europeans across a wide geographic range, found that the Basques were the closest living descendants of the Neolithic farming populations that had arrived in Western Europe from Anatolia thousands of years earlier. Subsequent work by Johannes Krause's group at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology refined this picture further, showing that the pre-Indo-European population of the Iberian Peninsula more broadly had been genetically similar to the Basques, suggesting the Basques are not an isolated oddity, but a continuation of something that was once much more widespread. What this means for the language is significant. Euskara is not related to any Indo-European language because the Basques are largely descended from people who were in Western Europe before the Bronze Age migrations that brought Indo-European languages to the continent. While those migrations reshaped the genetics and languages of virtually everyone else in Europe, the Basque region was either not reached by them or reached only minimally. The language the Basques speak today may represent the last surviving member of a family of languages that once extended across a much larger part of Western Europe, spoken by the Neolithic farming populations before the Bronze Age transformation. Why the Basque region was largely bypassed by migrations that swept across the rest of the continent is the part that has not been satisfactorily explained. The Pyrenean Mountains form a natural barrier between the Iberian Peninsula and the rest of Europe, and it has been suggested that the specific geography of the Western Pyrenees provided enough of an obstacle to slow or redirect the movement of steppe-associated populations. But this explanation has a problem. Other mountain populations elsewhere in Europe, including in regions with terrain that is comparably challenging to cross, carry much higher levels of steppe ancestry than the Basques. Geography alone does not account for what happened here. It is also worth noting that the Basques were not completely untouched by Bronze Age change. They do carry some steppe-related ancestry, which means contact occurred. What is unusual is the degree to which they maintained a predominantly pre-Bronze Age genetic profile relative to their neighbors. Whether this reflects a particularly strong resistance to outside influence, a specific geographic or social barrier that slowed integration more effectively here than elsewhere, or simply the particular way population movements played out in this corner of Europe, is still being worked out. The broader picture that emerges from the genetic research is one of a continent whose population history was considerably more turbulent and complex than anyone understood before ancient DNA analysis became possible. The idea of European populations as having been settled in their current locations for a very long time does not hold up. Most modern Europeans are the product of several major population movements layered on top of each other across thousands of years. The Basques are unusual not because they are ancient in some absolute sense, but because they carry a higher proportion of an earlier layer than the populations around them, and because their language, which normally would have been replaced along with the genetic shift, somehow survived. What Euskara actually preserves from the pre-Indo-European world, what words and grammatical structures might reflect how those early Neolithic farmers of Western Europe thought about and described their world, is a question that historical linguists continue to work on. With no related languages to compare it to, the tools normally used to reconstruct language history cannot be applied. Euskara has to be approached on its own terms, and what it can tell us about the linguistic world that existed in Western Europe before the Bronze Age remains only partially understood. On the Golan Heights Plateau in the Middle East, sitting in a region that has been studied by archaeologists, historians, and biblical scholars for well over a century, there is a massive stone monument that most people have never heard of. It has two names. In Arabic, it is called Rujm el-Hiri, the Wheel of Ghosts. In Hebrew, it is Gilgal Rephaim, the Wheel of the Giants, the Rephaim being a legendary race of giants mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. Both names were given by people who found the structure already ancient and had no idea who had built it. The monument sits on a flat basalt plateau near the Sea of Galilee, in the area now under Israeli administration. It consists of 4 concentric stone rings arranged around a large central cairn, the whole structure covering an area approximately 160 meters across. The stone used to build it. Basalt gathered from the surrounding volcanic plateau has been estimated at somewhere between 40,000 and 60,000 tons in total. The outer ring, the largest of the four, still stands up to 2.5 meters high and 2.5 meters wide in places. The rings are not perfectly uniform, but they are clearly deliberate, clearly planned, and clearly the product of a significant and sustained effort. The central cairn is approximately 15 meters across and 5 meters high. Excavation of this central feature has produced human remains and burial goods that date to the Middle Bronze Age, roughly 2000 to 1500 BC. The cairn appears to have functioned as a burial monument, and the human remains confirm that at some point it was used for that purpose. What is less clear is whether the burial function came first and the rings were built around it, or whether the rings came first and the central cairn was added later as a secondary use of an already existing monument. The broader construction of the rings is believed to date to the Chalcolithic period or the early Bronze Age, roughly 4500 to 2000 BC, based on the pottery and material found at the site. That would place the original construction anywhere from 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, making Rujm el-Hiri older than Stonehenge and older than the pyramids of Egypt. The dating is not precise enough to pin down the exact period, and the wide range of the estimate reflects how difficult the site has been to date with confidence. The Golan Plateau is not short of ancient monuments. Dolmens, the megalithic burial chambers built from 2 or more upright stones topped with a large capstone, are found across the plateau in large numbers, representing a regional tradition of stone monument building that goes back thousands of years. Rujm el-Hiri fits within that broader tradition, but takes it to a completely different scale. Building a single dolmen requires moving and placing a handful of large stones. Building Rujm el-Hiri required moving tens of thousands of tons of basalt into 4 concentric rings across a volcanic plateau, which implies a level of social organization and coordinated labor that goes well beyond what was needed for the single-chamber tombs found nearby. Who organized that effort is unknown. The early Bronze Age societies of the southern Levant were becoming increasingly complex during this period, developing agriculture, trade networks, and the beginnings of urban settlement. But they are not well enough documented archaeologically to confidently assign a specific group with specific leadership structures to a project of this scale. The monument is there, the stones are there, and the identity of whoever decided to build it and directed the work remains completely open. The site was spotted from the air, and first formally documented by researchers in the 1960s and 70s. Since then, it has been the subject of surface survey, aerial photography, and limited excavation, primarily focused on the central cairn. What lies beneath the ring walls themselves, and in the spaces between the rings, has never been systematically investigated. The monument has not been fully excavated. Given its scale, a thorough excavation would be a major undertaking, and the ongoing political complexity of the Golan Heights has not made large-scale archaeological projects straightforward to organize. The most discussed open question about the rings, beyond who built them, is what they were actually for. The burial function of the central cairn provides one answer for one element of the site, but it does not explain the rings. Several researchers have proposed that the openings built into the rings were deliberately aligned with astronomical events, specifically the summer solstice sunrise and the winter solstice sunrise. A study by Jonathan Mizrachi and colleagues, published in the journal Biblical Archaeologist, examined the alignment question in detail and found evidence supporting the idea that the openings were intentionally oriented towards solstice positions. If that is correct, it would place Rujm el-Hiri alongside Stonehenge, Newgrange, and the Goseck Circle in Germany as part of a broader ancient tradition of building monuments that mark the movement of the sun across the year. The astronomical alignment interpretation has not been universally accepted. Other researchers have questioned whether the evidence is strong enough to confirm intentional alignment rather than coincidental orientation, and the debate has continued without resolution. Part of the difficulty is that without a complete excavation of the site, the full picture of how the monument was laid out and how its various elements relate to each other is not available. The 2 names given to the site by people who found it unexplained are worth noting. Wheel of Ghosts and Wheel of Giants both reflect the same response, a structure so large and so old that the people who encountered it could not account for it through normal historical memory and attributed it instead to supernatural or legendary beings. The same pattern appears at the Gantija temples in Malta, at Stonehenge itself, and at megalithic sites across the world. When a monument outlasts the cultural memory of the people who built it, the explanations that fill the gap tend to involve giants, gods, or ghosts. At Rujm el-Hiri, after decades of modern archaeological study, the gap in knowledge is smaller than it was, but the central questions remain open. In 1948, a British diplomat named Sir Alec Kirkbride was flying over the desert of central Jordan when he looked down and saw something that made no immediate sense. Running across the landscape below him, stretching north to south through the open desert, was a wall. Not a short boundary marker or a ruined building, but a long, deliberate, linear structure that went on further than he could track from the air. He noted it, reported it, and the question of what it was has never been properly answered. The wall is called the Khatt Shebib. It runs for approximately 150 kilometers across the Jordanian desert, built from loose stones stacked into a low barrier roughly 1 meter high and 1 meter wide. Some sections are more carefully built than others, with stones more deliberately placed and the line more clearly defined. Other sections are rougher, lower, and harder to distinguish from the natural scatter of rock across the desert floor. It is not a continuous line either. It breaks into long stretches with gaps between them, which might mean deliberate openings were built into the design, or simply that parts of it have collapsed or been taken apart over the centuries by people using the stones for other purposes. What remains is one of the most puzzling structures in the region. The landscape it crosses gives some sense of the scale of the undertaking. Central Jordan is a mix of basalt fields, limestone plateau, and open desert, a landscape that is harsh, exposed, and not easy to move through. Building a wall across it, even a low one, required sourcing and placing stones consistently across a distance that would take days to walk. The wall does not follow a straight line either. It curves and shifts with the terrain, suggesting the people who built it were responding to the landscape as they went, rather than working from a fixed plan laid out in advance. That in itself points to a significant and organized effort, rather than something put together informally. The name Khatt Shebib comes from a figure in Arab legend named Shebib ibn Yazid, who some medieval Islamic texts credit with building a great wall across the desert. Whether that legend has anything to do with the actual wall has never been shown. It is more likely that later people, finding a wall they could not explain, simply attached a familiar name to it. That happens a lot with ancient structures, and it does not get us any closer to an answer. The name has stuck regardless, and it is what researchers and locals use to refer to it today. The wall crosses a part of Jordan that has a very well-recorded history. The Nabateans, the people who carved Petra from the red cliffs of southern Jordan, controlled this region from around the 4th century BC and built roads, water channels, and agricultural systems across it. The Romans took over in 106 AD, establishing the province of Arabia Petraea and continuing to develop the infrastructure of the region. The Byzantines followed, and then came the early Islamic world. Every one of these cultures left traces in the landscape around the wall. Not one of them left a record of building it. Attempts to date the wall have been made using pottery and other small finds from the surrounding area, but the results have not been helpful. The best estimate puts construction somewhere between 200 BC and 600 AD, a window of nearly 8 centuries that covers several completely different empires and cultures. That is such a wide range that it tells us almost nothing useful about who is actually responsible. The pottery found near the wall does not narrow things down because the region was continuously occupied across the whole period, and material from multiple eras shows up across the landscape, regardless of the wall's construction date. The most thorough modern study was done by David Kennedy and a team from the University of Western Australia, working from aerial photography and satellite imagery alongside ground survey work. Their survey found sections of the wall that had not been recorded before, which means the wall may actually be longer than the 150-kilometer figure that has been the standard estimate for decades. Kennedy's team mapped the route of the wall in more detail than any previous study and noted that it consistently sits in a zone separating farming land to the west from open grazing territory to the east, which shaped their thinking about what it might have been for. Their best guess was that the Khatt Shebib served as an agricultural boundary, a physical line keeping grazing animals out of cultivated fields. In the ancient Near East, tension between settled farmers and nomadic pastoralists was a recurring feature of life, and physical barriers between farming and grazing land are documented in other parts of the region. The idea fits the geography and the land use pattern around the wall reasonably well, but Kennedy's team were also clear that the evidence does not confirm it, and that the real answer is still unknown. Other researchers have suggested different explanations. Some think it was a territorial marker between two political groups, a line on the ground establishing where one jurisdiction ended and another began. Others have compared it to desert kites, the large stone funnel structures found across the region that were used to channel animals toward hunters. Under that reading, the wall might have been part of a system for directing animal movement across the desert rather than simply blocking it. A fourth idea is that it marked the edge of a road or track. That explanation has the least support, but has not been entirely ruled out. The problem with all of these theories is the same. None of them can be confirmed from what the site currently offers. The wall has not been excavated in any serious or systematic way. Ground survey of the full length remains incomplete because the terrain is difficult and the sheer length of the structure makes a comprehensive field investigation a major undertaking. There are long sections of the wall that researchers have never physically walked. What a proper investigation across the full 150 kilometers might find has never been established because that work has not been done. What stands out most about the Khatt Shebib is not just the missing explanation, but the missing record. The Nabateans kept records of what they built. The Romans kept detailed records of infrastructure projects across their provinces. The Byzantines kept records. The early Islamic administration kept records. Building a wall 150 kilometers long across open desert would have taken significant time, labor, and organization under any of these governments, and any of them would normally have left some trace of it. There is nothing, no inscription on the wall itself, no administrative document, no mention in any surviving text from any period that can be confidently tied to the structure sitting out in the Jordanian desert. And for a region as historically well documented as this one, a 150-kilometer wall with no name, no builder, and no paper trail is a genuinely strange thing to encounter. We are heading back to Peru for this next one, specifically to the southern coast, to a desert peninsula where a Peruvian archaeologist made a discovery in 1928 that has been generating debate ever since, and where the central question raised by that discovery has still not been fully resolved. The Paracas culture occupied the southern coast of Peru from roughly 800 to 100 BC. They are best known for two things: their textiles, which are considered among the finest ever produced in the ancient world, with thread counts and dye work that still impress textile specialists today, and their burials, which is where this story begins. In 1928, Julio Tello, one of the founding figures of Peruvian archaeology, excavated a cemetery site at Cerro Colorado on the Paracas Peninsula. What he found there were hundreds of mummy bundles, each one a tightly wrapped individual surrounded by grave goods, including ceramics, food, weapons, and examples of those extraordinary textiles. The dry desert conditions of the peninsula had preserved the bundles remarkably well, and when they were opened, the physical remains inside were in good condition for material that was over 2,000 years old. Among the individuals uncovered, a significant number had elongated skulls, not slightly elongated, but dramatically so, with the back of the skull extending far further upward and backward than normal human skull proportions would allow. The degree of elongation in the most extreme examples was striking enough that photographs of the skulls, when they began circulating widely in the 21st century, attracted immediate attention from people with no background in archaeology who could see with their own eyes that something unusual was going on. Before getting into what makes these skulls genuinely puzzling, it is worth establishing the mainstream explanation, because it is well supported and applies to the large majority of what was found. Intentional cranial modification through head binding is a documented practice across numerous ancient cultures worldwide. In the ancient Andes, it was particularly widespread, with different binding styles used by different cultural groups, apparently as markers of social or political identity. The practice involves wrapping an infant's head tightly during the period when the cranial bones are still malleable, typically the first few years of life, and maintaining that binding long enough to permanently reshape the skull as it grows. The result is an elongated form that is retained for the rest of the individual's life. This explanation accounts for elongated skulls across Peru and Bolivia, including many of the Paracas examples, and it is the position of mainstream archaeology. The Paracas culture's use of cranial modification fits within a broader Andean tradition that is well documented at multiple sites across the region. Where it gets more complicated is with a specific subset of the most extreme Paracas specimens, and with two particular features that some researchers have argued the binding explanation does not fully account for. The first is the parietal plate. A normal human skull has two parietal bones, one on each side of the top of the skull, meeting at the center in a joint called the sagittal suture. Several of the most extreme Paracas skulls appear to have a single parietal plate rather than two separate bones joined by a suture. This is not something that head binding produces. Binding reshapes the skull by redirecting growth, but it does not cause two bones to fuse into one or prevent the sagittal suture from forming. If the single parietal plate observation is accurate and consistent across multiple specimens, it represents a genuine anatomical difference rather than a deformation effect. The second is cranial volume. Head binding reshapes a skull, but does not increase its internal capacity. The total volume of the skull stays roughly the same, whether the shape is round or elongated. Some of the Paracas skulls have been reported with cranial volumes significantly above the normal human range, with some figures cited at 60% or more above average. If those measurements are accurate, they are not explained by binding. Both of these points have become central to the ongoing debate, and both of them come with a significant problem. The detailed, independent, peer-reviewed measurement and analysis of the most extreme specimens under controlled scientific conditions with published results has not been comprehensively carried out. The observations about parietal plates and cranial volumes have come primarily from researchers working outside the mainstream academic structure, and the data has not been subjected to the level of scrutiny that would be needed to confirm or rule out the claims with confidence. The DNA question adds another layer. Around 2014, a project led by researcher Brian Forster, working with geneticist Lloyd Pye, publicized results from DNA analysis of Paracas skull samples. The reported findings suggested mitochondrial DNA haplogroups that did not match known Andean populations or any other known human group. These results attracted enormous online attention. They were never published in a peer-reviewed journal, and the methodology behind them was questioned by geneticists who reviewed what was publicly available about the analysis. A peer-reviewed study of ancient DNA from Paracas individuals, published in the journal PLOS ONE by Farron Schmitz and colleagues, examined genetic material from the region and found results entirely consistent with known South American populations. The study found no evidence of unusual or anomalous genetic material in the samples analyzed. The tension between these two bodies of evidence, one peer-reviewed and finding nothing unusual, one not peer-reviewed and claiming something significant, is where the debate currently sits. The mainstream archaeological position is clear and backed by published science. The alternative claims about parietal plates and cranial volumes remain unresolved, not because they have been tested and found wrong, but because they have not been tested to the standard required to either confirm or dismiss them. The Paracas skulls are held primarily at the Paracas History Museum in the town of Paracas, and at other Peruvian institutions. Access for independent researchers has been limited at various points, which has added to the frustration of those who argue that a thorough, independent analysis of the most extreme specimens would settle the debate, one way or the other. Whether that analysis will be carried out under conditions that produce publishable peer-reviewed results remains an open question. What is not in dispute is that the Paracas Peninsula Cemetery produced an extraordinary set of human remains, that some of those remains show unusual physical characteristics, and that the full picture of what the Paracas culture was and where it fits in the broader story of South American prehistory is still being worked out. Ancient DNA research across South America has consistently produced surprises about population history in the region, and the Paracas culture's place within that history has not been definitively established. In a library at Yale University, there is a book that has been sitting unread for 600 years. Not unread because nobody has tried. Unread because nobody has been able to. The Voynich Manuscript is a handwritten, illustrated book of approximately 240 pages, written entirely in an unknown script and filled with colored drawings that have never been satisfactorily explained. It is catalogued at Yale's Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library as MS408, and it has attracted more sustained academic and cryptographic attention than almost any other document in the world. Teams from Bletchley Park, the Second World War code-breaking center that cracked the Nazi Enigma cipher, looked at it. The United States National Security Agency looked at it. Linguists, manuscript scholars, statisticians, and historians have all taken their turns. None of them have produced a translation that the academic community has accepted. The manuscript came to wider attention in 1912 when Wilfrid Voynich, a Polish book dealer with a reputation for tracking down rare manuscripts, purchased it from the Jesuit College of Villa Mondragone near Frascati in Italy. Voynich immediately recognized it as unusual and began trying to have it decoded, which is how the long sequence of failed attempts began. Radiocarbon dating carried out by the University of Arizona in 2009 dated the vellum, the prepared animal skin the book is written on, to between 1400 and 1440 AD. The book's physical materials are therefore confirmed as early 15th century, though the text could in theory have been written later on older material. The provenance before Voynich's purchase is partially known. A letter found with the manuscript, written in 1666 by Johannes Marcus Marci, Charles University in Prague, to the Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher in Rome, records that the book had previously been owned by the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, who reigned from 1576 to 1612. Rudolf was known for his obsessive collection of unusual, rare, and occult objects, and according to the letter, he paid 600 ducats for the manuscript, which was an enormous sum. Before Rudolf's ownership, the trail goes cold. The content of the manuscript is divided into sections that researchers have given working labels based on what the illustrations appear to show. The botanical section contains drawings of plants, most of which do not clearly match any known species. Some appear to combine features of different real plants in ways that could suggest imagination, symbolic representation, or a deliberate attempt to obscure the connection to real botanical knowledge. The astronomical section has circular diagrams with what appear to be star patterns and zodiac-like figures that do not straightforwardly match any known astronomical tradition. The biological section is the one that tends to attract the most attention, containing groups of nude female figures submerged in or moving through elaborate systems of pipes and pools, the meaning of which has never been established. The cosmological and pharmaceutical sections contain further diagrams and what appear to be containers of herbs or medicines, again without clear identification. The script itself is the central puzzle. It uses between 20 and 30 distinct characters, depending on how certain ambiguous forms are classified, arranged into what look like words and sentences. The text follows consistent internal patterns, with certain character combinations appearing regularly and others never appearing at all, which is a feature of real languages rather than random symbol sequences. Statistical analysis of the text has found that the letter and word frequency distributions are similar to those of natural human languages, which suggests the script is encoding something with a real linguistic structure, rather than being purely decorative or random. But what that structure encodes has not been identified. No researcher has matched the Voynich script to any known language or writing system. No proposed translation has produced readable content that other scholars have been able to verify. The script appears to be unique, with no close parallels in any other known manuscript tradition. The theories about what the manuscript is and where it came from cover a very wide range. The most straightforward possibility is that it is a genuine text in a natural language, written in an enciphered or encoded form that has not yet been cracked. Many historical manuscripts were written in cipher to protect medical, alchemical, or other specialist knowledge from outside readers, and a sophisticated cipher from the 15th century could in principle still resist modern analysis. A second possibility is that the script is an artificial language invented by its author, of which several examples were produced in the early modern periods. A third possibility, taken seriously by some manuscript scholars, is that the whole thing is a hoax produced to deceive wealthy collectors like Rudolf II, who would pay large sums for unusual and apparently arcane documents. Under this reading, the script would be meaningless, constructed to look like a real language without actually encoding anything. In 2019, a paper published in the journal Romance Studies by Gerard Cheshire claimed that the manuscript had been deciphered as a form of Proto-Romance language, a medieval dialect that predated modern Romance languages like Spanish, French, and Italian. The claim attracted significant media coverage. It also attracted immediate and widespread criticism from linguists and manuscript scholars, who pointed to fundamental problems with the methodology and the proposed readings. The journal subsequently retracted the paper following a review process. It was not the first claimed decipherment of the Voynich manuscript, and it was not the first retraction. The Basques library digitized the manuscript and made high-resolution images of every page freely available online, which means the document is now more accessible to researchers than at any point in its history. The open availability has brought in new attempts from outside traditional academic disciplines, including computational linguists and machine learning researchers who have applied modern analytical tools to the text. These efforts have produced interesting observations about the statistical properties of the script, but have not produced a reading. 600 years after it was made, the Voynich manuscript remains exactly what it was when Wilfrid Voynich pulled it out of a collection in Italy in 1912. A book full of text and illustrations, carefully made, clearly significant to whoever produced it, and still completely unreadable to everyone who has tried since. From an unreadable manuscript in a Yale library, we move to the jungles and hills of southwestern India, where thousands of ancient stone structures are sitting in the landscape largely unstudied and in many cases unrecorded. The Kerala dolmens are not a single famous site or a single famous mystery. They are a tradition spread across a large area of South India, and the question they raise is one that researchers have been aware of since the 19th century without arriving at a satisfying answer. Kerala, the southwestern state of India bordered by the Arabian Sea to the west and the Western Ghats Mountains to the east, contains an estimated 2,000 or more dolmens. That estimate is uncertain because a comprehensive modern survey of the region has never been completed. New sites continue to be reported by local researchers working in areas that formal archaeology has not yet covered, so the actual total may be higher. Neighboring states, Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, contain thousands more, along with related megalithic structures, including stone circles, standing stones called menhirs, and large burial urns. Taken together, South India has one of the largest concentrations of megalithic burial monuments anywhere in the world. A dolmen, for those unfamiliar with the term, is a simple but substantial structure. 2 or more large upright stones are placed in the ground to form the walls of a small chamber, and a single large flat stone is laid across the top as a capstone. The result is a covered space used as a burial chamber. They are found in Europe, in Korea, in parts of the Middle East, and across South and Southeast Asia. The Kerala versions follow exactly the same basic design as the ones in France, Ireland, Spain, and Britain, built thousands of kilometers away and, based on current dating, by people with no documented connection to each other. The Kerala dolmens date primarily to the Iron Age in South Asia, roughly 1000 to 300 BC, though some may be earlier. They were first formally documented by British colonial-era archaeologists in the 19th century, with more systematic survey work carried out by scholars including Frederick Price in the early 20th century. What those early researchers noticed, and what has been noted by every researcher who has worked on the subject since, is how closely the South Indian dolmens resemble their European counterparts in basic form. The material culture associated with the South Indian megalithic builders includes distinctive black and red ware pottery, iron objects, and evidence of elaborate burial practices involving multiple individuals placed in the same chamber over time, with significant grave goods accompanying them. This burial tradition points to communities who placed considerable importance on how their dead were treated and commemorated, investing in permanent stone structures that would mark the location of the buried individuals and presumably allow for ongoing ritual activity at the site. Who exactly built these structures is not established. The South Indian megalithic tradition predates the beginning of written records for this region, which means the builders left no direct account of themselves. Their relationship to the later historical populations of South India is inferred rather than proven. Some researchers have connected the megalithic builders to the Dravidian-speaking communities who have lived in South India for a very long time, pointing to cultural continuities across the long stretch of time between the megalithic period and the historical period. But continuity across time does not confirm direct descent, and the connection remains an inference based on circumstantial evidence rather than a demonstrated fact. The comparison with European dolmens is where the most discussed and least resolved question sits. The structural similarity between South Indian dolmens and those found in Europe has been noted since researchers began formally studying them, and it has never been satisfactorily explained. The two traditions are separated by thousands of kilometers and by a significant time gap. European megalithic construction peaked between roughly 4000 and 2000 BC and was largely complete before the South Indian tradition reached its height. The people building dolmens in France or Ireland and the people building them in Kerala were not in direct contact with each other as far as any evidence shows. Three explanations have been put forward for the similarity. The first is independent invention, the idea that both traditions arrived at the same architectural solution independently because the dolmen form is a practical and relatively straightforward way to build a covered burial chamber from large stones. This is the explanation favored by most mainstream archaeologists, and it is the simplest reading of the available evidence. The second is cultural diffusion, the idea that knowledge of the dolmen form spread from one region to another through trade and migration networks that connected different parts of the Old World over long periods. The third is a shared origin, the idea that both traditions descend from an earlier common practice that has not yet been identified in the archaeological record. None of these explanations has been confirmed. Independent invention is the default position, but it has a weakness that researchers acknowledge. The degree of structural similarity between the South Indian and European dolmen traditions is considerable, going beyond the basic form to include details of construction technique and spatial organization that might be expected to vary more widely if the two traditions genuinely developed in complete isolation. A study by Shinde and colleagues examining the broader South Asian megalithic tradition looked at the distribution and variety of monument types across the region and argued for regional development with contact between subregions within South Asia, but did not directly tackle the question of how the South Indian tradition relates to what was happening in Europe at earlier dates. The practical problem is that the knowledge base for making this comparison is not complete on either side. In Europe, megalithic studies have been ongoing for well over a century, and the tradition is reasonably well documented. In Kerala and the surrounding states, the survey work, has been partial. Sites that were known to local communities for generations are only now being formally recorded, and the full picture of the regional tradition, how many structures exist, what their range of forms is, and how they are distributed across the landscape, is not yet available. A comprehensive modern survey using current methods, including aerial and satellite imaging to identify sites in forested and difficult terrain, has not been carried out. What South India has is an enormous and largely understudied megalithic tradition that raises a genuine question about prehistoric connectivity that archaeology has not yet answered, and a landscape that is almost certainly still giving up sites that formal research has not yet reached. We finished tonight in central India, at a monument that most people interested in ancient history will have heard of and far fewer will know in any real detail. The Great Stupa at Sanchi is one of the oldest stone structures in India, one of the best preserved examples of early Buddhist architecture in the world, and a UNESCO World Heritage Site that has been studied seriously by researchers for well over a century. It also contains puzzles that those researchers have not fully solved. Sitting in plain sight, on a hilltop in the state of Madhya Pradesh. The stupa was originally commissioned by the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka around 250 BC. Ashoka is one of the most significant figures in the history of ancient India, a ruler who came to power through military conquest and then underwent a dramatic personal transformation after the Kalinga War, a conflict that resulted in enormous casualties and that Ashoka's own inscriptions describe as having left him overwhelmed by the scale of the suffering. He converted to Buddhism, renounced further military expansion, and spent the rest of his reign promoting Buddhist principles across his empire, commissioning the construction of stupas to enshrine relics of the Buddha at sacred sites across the subcontinent. Sanchi was among the most important of these. The original Ashokan stupa was a solid hemispherical mound of brick built over a relic deposit, surrounded by a wooden railing. During the Shunga period, in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, the structure was significantly enlarged. The brick mound was encased in stone, the drum base was added, the surrounding railing was rebuilt in stone, and 4 elaborately carved stone gateways called toranas were constructed at the cardinal points around the monument. The Shunga dynasty was associated with a revival of Brahmanical religious tradition rather than Buddhism, which makes their continued investment in developing a Buddhist site like Sanchi an interesting historical detail. Sanchi appears to have held a significance that crossed the sectarian boundaries of the time. The toranas are what most visitors to Sanchi come to see, and they are extraordinary objects. Each gateway consists of 2 square vertical posts and 3 curved horizontal beams stacked one above the other, and every surface of every element is covered in carved relief scenes. The density of the carving is remarkable. Figures, animals, architectural elements, trees, celestial beings, and narrative scenes are packed across every available face of each gateway, arranged in horizontal registers that run across the beams and up and down the posts. The total quantity of carved information across the 4 toranas is enormous, representing a major artistic and religious program produced in the 1st century BC. The problem, from a research perspective, is that the full logic of how those scenes are organized and what they are meant to communicate together has not been worked out. Individual scenes have been identified, matched to known stories from the Buddha's life and from the Jataka tales of his previous incarnations, and placed in their narrative context. But the overall program, the sequence in which the scenes are meant to be read, the relationships between scenes on different gateways, and the broader symbolic architecture of the composition as a whole, has been debated by scholars for over a century without reaching consensus. Different researchers have proposed different reading sequences and different frameworks for understanding how the gateways were meant to work together as a unified religious statement, and the debate is still active. One of the most distinctive features of the Sanchi carvings is what is absent from them. The Buddha himself never appears in human form anywhere in the carvings, despite being the central subject of the scenes. The toranas were made during a period before the tradition of depicting the Buddha as a human figure had developed. That tradition emerged later in the Gandhara region of what is now northwestern Pakistan and Afghanistan, where Greek artistic conventions introduced by Alexander the Great's campaigns blended with Buddhist iconography to produce the first anthropomorphic images of the Buddha. At Sanchi, his presence is shown through symbols: a wheel representing the first sermon, a throne indicating where he sat, a parasol marking his position as a great being, footprints, or a Bodhi tree beneath which he achieved enlightenment. The scenes that surround these symbolic markers, showing crowds of worshippers, historical events, celestial beings, and architectural spaces, have to be read with the understanding that the central figure they all relate to is never directly shown. How to correctly reconstruct the narrative meaning of the scenes, given this symbolic approach to the main subject, is part of what makes the Sanchi carving program so difficult to fully decode. A study by Julia Shaw, published in the journal World Archaeology, took a different approach to understanding the site by looking outward from the stupa rather than inward at the carvings. Shaw examined the relationship between Sanchi and the surrounding landscape, mapping smaller satellite monuments, settlements, water management features, and agricultural systems in the wider region. Her analysis argued that Sanchi should be understood as the center of a much larger sacred and economic landscape, rather than as an isolated monument. This landscape approach changed how researchers think about the site's function and significance, suggesting it played a role in organizing and sustaining the surrounding communities in ways that went beyond purely religious commemoration. The engineering of the Great Stupa itself has also attracted attention. The hemispherical dome is geometrically precise in a way that required accurate planning and measurement to achieve. The drum base is level, and the dome rises from it in a consistent curve that has maintained its form for over 2,000 years. Producing this kind of geometric accuracy in the 3rd century BC, using the construction techniques and measuring tools available at the time, involved a level of knowledge about geometry and construction planning that the surviving record does not fully document. How Mauryan builders achieved this precision is not comprehensively understood. Recent ground-penetrating radar surveys of the Stupa mound have attempted to image the interior of the structure without excavating it, looking for information about the original relic deposit placed by Ashoka and the internal organization of the mound. The surveys have produced data about the structure inside the dome, but have not resolved questions about the original contents of the relic chamber or the full sequence of how the monument was built and modified over time. The interior of the Great Stupa at Sanchi has never been excavated, and what exactly Ashoka placed at its heart in the 3rd century BC remains unknown. For a monument this well studied, at a site this significant, with this much academic attention directed at it across more than a century of research, the list of things that remain genuinely unresolved is longer than most people would expect.